Thanks again. So I'm bringing back like the class of 2020 on there. Myles joined us in 2020, and I'll let him say words about himself. Jenny Ross and Martin Mocker wrote a book then that came out called Design for Digital that I showed you a few days ago. They could not, Jenny couldn't attend, Martin was going to attend flight travels, he couldn't come. So Myles delivered the presentation at that event on Design for Digital. One other aspect about, Myles is, I'm a bit of a lazy reader. I read a lot, yes, but I rely on other people doing some analysis and curation and sense-making material. Myles, I encourage you to follow Myles. Myles is one of the guys that Harvard Business Review reaches out to basically read a book, write an article book well before the book is even seen. So if you want to follow, get a heads up on books that are coming in Key Insights, Myles is your guy. Myles?
Thank you. So what a great talk, Feroz. I loved it. And we didn't coordinate anything, but my talk is going to fit really nicely with his.
I coordinated.
Oh, okay. So how many of you have seen the movie Apollo 13? Great. The best moment in that movie is when they're trying to figure out, how do I bring the astronauts back? And the systems engineer says, it's all about power. It all collapses to that. And that's what great system engineers do. And the fact of the matter is, I have loved being here every moment because I'm with fellow systems thinkers. And I hope you can teach it, but we're only 5% of the population. So I get to be with the 5% of the population when I come to these who think like I do. And so I'm going to take you on a journey from systems to ecosystems. I'm going to walk you from the management theory to how we got to be established. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we have to do to move to the future. And that's pretty much what I've got here. I'm going to start with business complexity. I'm going to talk about how the world has gotten even more complex. I'm going to talk about how what we've been doing, drawing boxes and lines and things like that, may not work as we go forward, and so why we need to look at Gen AI, not necessarily just because our companies need it to differentiate their businesses, because we need it to do architecture, and then I'll give you some key takeaways. Now, there aren't a lot of copies of this book left. But if you're serious about enterprise architecture, I'm going to suggest we make a run on this book. This book by Russell Ackoff will change how you think. It was the first book that applied systems thinking to business, and there's still ideas in there. I refer to it all the time. So creating the corporate future is something that should be in your bookshelf. It will challenge you as an architect in terms of how you think about systems. And what Russell Ackoff proclaimed in this book was the end of the machine age. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but it's a great book. But he also proclaimed a couple other things. So let's just go through what he said. He said change is accelerating. And he was talking not just about technology, because as Feroz said, it's not just about technology, it's about the human element. So we have societal changes which are incredibly fast occurring, and these things kind of work together. He then said delays can be disastrous to companies. And it's true. We see it all along, and I'll give you some numbers in just a minute to show you how disastrous it can be. The rate of change is increasing to the point where our problems are increasing. So think about that for just a moment. Our change rate increases, the problems are increasing, the complexity of them increases, and that makes the world even more complex. And then he went on to say that the complexity of our problems means it's harder to solve them and they have shorter answers. So we've got this really tough thing we're navigating through. We got to find answers. We have to love the problems, but we have to be able to find solutions, and those solutions aren't going to last as long. So what we need is a new worldview. We need to be able to think about change in a different way. We need to be able to accept change. And it was very interesting. I got to talk a few years ago to the CIO at the American Cancer Society, and I'll never forget what he told me about change. He said, the reality is everybody in this organization knew we had to change and why we needed to change and why it impacted people who had cancer. But at the end of the day, we were changing somebody's life. So we have to always remember, when we make change happen, and architects fundamentally are the strategic planners of the digital age, we are impacting people's lives, and we need to help them cope with that change. Our change won't be successful. In fact, I like to call change that gets instituted from the top and doesn't get accepted a Kodak moment, because that's exactly what happened at Kodak. Now, in terms of consequences, think about this. 88% of the companies that were around in 1955 are no longer with us. And even more important, during COVID, that crisis, the average longevity of a public company dropped to 9 years. So we're change masters here. We need to help our CIOs succeed at doing change. That's what enterprise architecture at its core is about. Now, I want to talk a little bit about where did we come from and how did we get to where we are. So I talked a little bit earlier about machine age thinking. That really was about the following things. A mechanism, and there's a Charlie Chaplin movie that kind of shows humans as part of a mechanism. It was about analysis, it was about reductionism, cause and effect, and determinism. System thinking fundamentally changes that. It's about synthesis. It's not about what are all the parts in the body, but how do the systems of the body work together. That's what we are about. We're about formulating the mess. What are the capabilities? How does that all work? One thing that I didn't see this week, which I was disappointed about, capability thinking comes from strategy thinking. And the idea of capability thinking is, what are the 5 to 7 things that cause my company to win in the markets it's in? So yes, think about all the things that we do, but one of the questions architects don't ask enough is, well, if this isn't a core capability of who we are, why are we doing it? Maybe we don't need a finance department, or maybe finance is how we win. It depends on your organization, but we need to start asking harder questions. Now, one of the interesting things that we don't think about this enough is Teach, who is the fundamental first person. You can go find him. He's from Berkeley. He wrote about capabilities being dynamic and changing. And then, obviously, we think of capabilities as being part of architecture fundamentally, but TOGAF didn't add it until 2009 to 2016. So machine age thinking, move to systems thinking, we add capabilities thinking, and in 1987, enterprise architecture gets fundamentally defined by Zachman. Open Group then defined TOGAF. Enterprise Architecture Strategy came out. This is the Jeannie Ross book. I know that most of you have it on your shelves. If you don't, you need to go get a copy. But it defined what we do and how it connects to strategy. At the same time, we've started to see new things happen. So digital offerings came and became part of the way we think, as Jeannie Ross and her colleagues that we were just talked about wrote the Design for Digital. And then it got followed by a set of books on how do we think in the digital age. we have increasingly ecosystems. And then a final book, which I'm going to spend a lot of the rest of this is Open Group wrote a really interesting book in December. If you're like Paul, you can read my review first and then go get the book on ecosystems and how do organizations run increasingly. You know, we're finding ourselves in a world, I mean, even in software, we're finding ourselves in a world where everything has to connect and there's not one provider of everything. As much as we'd all like to do it, there isn't one provider. It all has to work together. So how do you manage those ecosystems? So this is kind of the threads. Management theory has driven enterprise architecture, and management theory, again, is driving a new type of enterprise architecture, what I'm going to talk about now, called ecosystems architecture. So this is the book I referred to. It's a great read. And one of the really cool things, and I'll show some of it at the end, is it explains how generative AI works, which for me, being an enterprise architect, I want to know how the pieces and parts work together to create a system, and I'll show you a little bit of that. So these are some of the key points out of the book. Complexity is increasing to a point where our systems approaches don't work. We can't necessarily model and understand how the bits and parts work together. Containing problems is becoming harder, because that's what we've done in architecture. We put blocks and diagrams together. We tried to figure out how all of the services of the business work together, but it doesn't work anymore. We can't boil it out with brute force. Obviously, this is a form of boiling it out. We've depended on containing, and we start with a vision of what's the business architecture, and we come down, and these are all great things to do, but we're ending up in a world where complexity is making that harder to do. So ecosystems are the networks. Think about your companies. It's not just who you service, it's that broader group out there of people that you work together and sell with. I mean, I was in a session a few years ago, and I was amazed because IBM got up and talked and said, our group competed with this other group over here, and we have to make their stuff work for our customers in order to deliver. So we're living in the world of ecosystems. Ecosystems are cooperation. So we have to be able to work with all those people. We can't just leave the connection to somebody else. And in addition, we need to have increasingly an ability to deal with the connectivity. The connectivity becomes a huge issue. So it's very interesting. One of the proponents of this thinking is Grady. And Grady basically is saying that there are three eras of architecture, and that we're entering a new one where Gen AI and large language models and neural nets are going to enable all of you to define architectures for the complexity that is coming. So one of the things they talk about in the book, which is really interesting, is that we thought functions, attributes, but when you start to think about ecosystems, you have to think clusters, domains, regions. It becomes a much harder thing to do. And an ecosystem has to be viewed as a whole. So I'm coming back to systems thinking. How does this whole ecosystem work? How do I put it together? They transcend corporate boundaries. So how do I put this together when I think of all my suppliers and how I sell and how I put it together? And so we've relied a lot on boxes and lines. And that's been important because companies need to understand how do all the pieces and parts work. But model-driven architecture can be transformative. And the world is just not as simple as our models have displayed. So AI has an advantage. It doesn't have to reduce the complexity. We can give it the whole and say, how do I put this together? Now, there's still work to do. We need to know what those capabilities are, and we need to be more of a strategist with our teams. but AI has an opportunity to transform how we do things. So just a little bit, if you haven't dug in under the covers, and again, this comes from the book, if we think about the world we've been in traditionally, where we stored data, it was in a database. And we had, when we put it into a business data warehouse type of system, we had a nice world of rows and columns. And so what I've done here is look at chicken brands, I've looked at deliciousness and succulence, and you basically put everything into its nice column. It was kind of like an Excel spreadsheet. Obviously, in a transactional system, it was more complex. But when we go to Gen AI, what happens is you plot those numbers into space. And basically, what you can do is you can measure the angular difference between things and then run a cosine function. And that gives me a value between 0 and 1. Now, here's the thing that's amazing. Humans can only do or think 7 things at one time. And having had this discussion with my wife, women can think 7 things at one time. Men, I'm sorry, we can only think of a couple, maybe. But this thing can think of 1,024, and in fact, the most recent version is 3,024 things at one time. That's why Gen AI is so promising to us, because it can think in dimensions that we can't. And for those of you who are in the AI track, you got to see that this has actually been done. So, this is something that William was able to do, where first of all, he said, draw the diagram for me. Because I know how much time it takes for me to draw a diagram and put the boxes on, and then it goes to an artist, and then they make it look pretty. But he had him draw the diagram, and then he did something I didn't know that generative AI could do at this point, and that is he actually had it put the architecture in and say, please give me recommendations on doing this better, which is absolutely amazing. We're at a cusp of a new way of thinking about architecture. So what are some practical things that you hopefully can walk away from this talk? First of all, everything Fro said, remember those. We have to be great humanists in order to be great architects. We need to take on this AI mindset. We need to understand how to use it so we can deal with the complexity that's out there. We can't abstract away all of that. We need to increasingly be thinking about interconnected systems and how they come together. And we need to understand the lineage. Where did we come from, and where are we going? So I hope this has been enlightening to you, and it's been a thrill being here again for a second time.
Should I bring back a third time?
Sure. Yes.
Okay. Sorry. That was like America's Got Talent or something like that. I don't know. So just one question, Myles. We talk about the skill side of things just for a second. You read a lot of stuff across so many different areas. What is the one thing from a skill side that you would most want to punctuate with this crowd?
I think, again, I'm here because I'm with fellow systems thinkers. You are so valuable to your enterprises. They may not know about it. I have a good friend who's an enterprise architect, and he said he was struggling in his first job.
Am I not your friend too?
Well, you are. But he said he was struggling in his first job because he kept thinking of how did everything go together? And they said, no, just code. What I would say is we need a more diverse community here. As in 5 years, I want to see a more diverse group of people here. And we need to, I'm going to tell one story about myself. When I was a kid...
I could tell a few others.
Well, I know. But when I was a kid, and my dad has a PhD in engineering from MIT, so he's very smart. But he would make fun of me because I was trying in the backyard to build a swimming pool. It was my playing with the mess. And he made fun of me and didn't ever encourage me. We're a little bit different group of people here. If you find somebody in your organization that thinks systems, send them to Feroce's Academy because we need the people who can think the companies and systems and transform their organizations.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good stuff.